3.5 years ago, a Bay of Plenty community was thrown into turmoil.
There is no sign of life on Whakaari, White Island tonight after the eruption at our most active volcano, and it's still too dangerous for recovery teams to go in. 47 people were on the Bay of Plenty Island at the time. 5 are confirmed dead, but 8 are still missing on the island, with officials saying it'll now be a recovery operation.
The final death toll from extreme burns and blast injuries was 22. This week, 6 parties involved in the tragedy go to trial.
There will be bigger questions in relation to this event. These questions must be asked and they must be answered.
It was a tragedy that gripped the small town in many ways.
The small team of 2 doctors and 6 nurses suddenly confronted with one of New Zealand's largest natural disasters.
It took a long time to register what we were seeing, like nothing else, you know, with so many people, and they were all covered in mud or ash, obviously horrific burns.
I met with first responders and health professionals this morning. They worked tirelessly in the most devastating circumstances. Many of them had not yet rested or slept. The toll that the impact of this extraordinary tragedy has had on them was obvious.
From the first responders and their whānau, the medical teams at the hospital, the council and emergency workers, the business owners hit by the tourism decline, and the iwi. Ngāti Awa was a leader in the days, weeks and months after the eruption, but at the same time its own business, White Island Tours, was under scrutiny. And this.
Many of the people who were held to account were people who, in that moment, were absolutely heroic. There's no other way to describe it.
I'm Sharon Brett-Kelly. Today on The Detail, the trial brings back the memories of that terrible day, December 9th, 2019. We're going to be looking at how it has brought a small town closer. But first, RNZ's senior journalist Amy Williams is covering the case in Auckland.
The trial is about the health and safety regime that these companies and individuals had in the lead up to the eruption. So it doesn't cover the day of the eruption or the rescue efforts afterwards.
And WorkSafe is laying the charges?
WorkSafe has laid the charges. So it relates to the Health and Safety at Work Act and the requirements that these companies and people had as directors of the companies, some of the companies, to keep their workers and tourists safe. However, there are 3 individuals, 3 Buttle brothers, who are part of the family that owns the island. They are charged as individuals because they are directors of one of the companies that effectively owns the island.
And we will talk about a bit more about the Buttles in a moment, but why is it being held in Auckland? Why not Whakatane or even Tauranga or Rotorua, which are so much closer?
Yeah, that's a good question because, of course, White Island is visible from the Whakatane township, and a lot of people who would be wanting to attend the trial live there. They did look at holding the trial in Whakatane. They even looked at a marae, which would have been potentially large enough to hold the trial. However, because of the sheer number of people who are expected to take part in the trial, because originally there were 13, then 9, then 6 defendants, just the number of people, the legal teams, the media interested, remember it garnered worldwide attention, as well as families who want to come and sit in the public gallery. And there are no courtrooms even around the country. They looked in the Bay of Plenty, they looked in Whakatane, no courtroom's big enough. Even the Auckland District Court, no courtroom is big enough there to hold the sheer number of people that are expected to be part of it. So they ended up going for neutral ground, and it's actually going to be held at the Environment Court in Auckland. It is unusual. We've had big trials take place in Auckland in the High Court, but even the High Court for this one was deemed not large enough.
On Friday, there was an 11th hour change. Tell me about that.
Yeah, 3 helicopter companies that either contracted helicopters to do tours on White Island or directly had helicopters going to the island doing tours, they were also charged by WorkSafe for health and safety breaches. Initially, they pled not guilty. On Friday, they pled guilty to amended charges, and they will be sentenced, so that will likely happen after trial.
Also, last month, June the 15th, White Island Tours pleaded guilty to 2 amended charges.
The charges laid by WorkSafe find that the company's risk assessment processes did not adequately identify the risk of a significant eruption.
The summary of facts basically said that White Island Tours failed to comply with its duties to its workers. It failed to conduct adequate risk assessments of the activity of tours on the island. And also it failed to consult with GNS Science about the ongoing hazards and risks. It also failed to provide appropriate PPE, personal protective equipment, to workers.
White Island Tours says it deeply regrets this. The company won't be sentenced until the charges against other defendants are resolved.
But they're not the only party to plead guilty.
GNS pled guilty in May this year. So GNS is the Crown Research Institute that monitors volcanoes. It had monitoring equipment set up on the island and an alert system about any uptick in volcanic activity. So the charges against GNS relate to multiple field trips that its staff took to the island before the eruption, particularly with regards to GNS's duty to the helicopter pilots who were contracted to it to take its staff to and from the island on those trips. So WorkSafe found GNS didn't sufficiently consult with the pilots about the risks. However, it had carried out risk assessments for its staff, it directly employed, which included volcanologists, who you'd expect to know all about that sort of thing, I guess, who went on the field trips. So the helicopter pilots regularly flew GNS workers to and from Whakaari, but they were required to remain on the island while GNS scientists carried out their fieldwork. Sometimes the pilots would also accompany the scientists on that fieldwork, even though they didn't have to. And so WorkSafe found that in the months leading up to the eruption, GNS staff were transported to and from Whakaari by helicopter pilots on 23 occasions. And they said that really GNS should have been consulting with the helicopter pilots as much as it had its own staff.
Amy, the Buttles, the family who own Whakaari, they tried to have their charges dropped.
The owners of Whakaari White Island, Andrew James and Peter Buttle, have failed in a bid to have health and safety charges against them dismissed. WorkSafe laid charges against the brothers in the wake of the 2019 Whakaari eruption, which killed 22 people. The Buttles' lawyers had argued that the charging documents were defective, but that argument wasn't accepted by Judge Evangelist Thomas.
So the Buttle family has owned the island since 1936, and there are a few privately owned islands in New Zealand, and this is one of them. Whakaari Management is the company that granted access to the island for tour operators. So they were given licence agreements. The tour operators paid an annual fee and a commission for every tourist that they took to the island. So that's money that went back to Whakaari Management, which is owned by these 3 brothers.
And more will emerge about them. They're very private, so I guess we will find out a bit more about them in court.
Yeah, that's right. The other interesting thing is that the organisations that have pled guilty, it's now possible that some of those will be among the witnesses in the trial.
The sombre silhouettes of families sharing their grief and love. Taking a moment to acknowledge the tragedy which rocked this coastal town 3 years ago.
Let's turn to the Whakatane community now, and Joe Harawira is the former chair of the Ngāti Trust. He won't talk about the trial itself, but says there has been a lot of angst for the iwi.
My role was to take the lead from an iwi perspective and to overlay the whole process of grieving in our wharenui, to work through that process with our community, to bring our community together in the time of tragedy. It was a feeling of shock. Everybody was just in shock.
Initially, for about a month afterwards, it was very eerie, very quiet, very silent. Leading up to Christmas was still silent and quiet.
I think there's still a bit of stunnedness about the place. It's not quite vibrant and jolly as it normally is. There's people sort of wandering around in a bit of a daze.
You just sort of go into a not a reflective mode, a retractive mode, I suppose, and say, what do we do? It's all unfolding at that very time as to how we would deal with the process. And what we thought we would do was to use the Matatua Whare as a base for the community to come to grieve, I suppose, to deal with the tragedy, to understand what had happened under the umbrella of what we call manaki tangata, to look after the people.
And that wharanui Matatua, it has remained central, really, to the memorial services and other things. People talk about that. The people who've come in from overseas, they talk about how important that was to them over time. And even the former Mayor Judy Turner talks about how essential it was to the whole process, the recovery process.
They were amazing. In fact, I would credit them with getting us through the issue. They opened their marae down at the heads every morning, and people flocked there. It was just comforting. I find iwi are very open about how grief can be given expression to and processed openly and honestly in a way that I don't necessarily think our Pākehā culture has always dealt with things that way. A whole lot of families who came out to New Zealand because their loved ones were in hospital somewhere in New Zealand came down to Whakatane to try and get a sense of what had happened.
I'll just paint a picture for you. On the morning of the recovery, we took a boatload of Australians and the family of the young Māori boy that passed away, the Mangi family. At 4:00, we took them out on the day of the recovery out to White Island. We left at 4:00 in the morning. We were able to carry out our tikanga in the form of karanga to our ancestor, our kuia Whakaari, which was followed by mihi mihi to those that were still on the island, about to be recovered. The wind was so strong and the grit was still coming off the island. You couldn't really face the island for too long, or else the stuff would get into your eyes and was stinging on your face. And we were probably anchored about 100 metres off the island. And I quoted a saying, a whakatauki, tini whetu ki te rangi, ka mautonu, ka mautonu. Tini tangata ki te whenua, ngaro noa, ngaro noa. And what that means is that the bright shining stars will always be there on the black hair of night, but we, the people on the land, will be lost. From the Māori perspective, we look at all of those stars up in the heavens, and every single one of those stars is an ancestor of ours. From that day on, they could walk out the back door, look up to the stars and look for the brightest star in the sky and have a conversation. That's their loved one who's on the island at the moment.
By the time we took them off the boat at about 6 a.m, they were undone. They were just, they just fell into our arms. And it was one of them, I always remember this Australian man said to me this, he said, excuse the language, he said, I didn't understand a bloody word they said, but I felt it. And I said, yes, that's what it's like for us.
They said that, well, there was something powerful happened to me out there. I don't know what it is. And so basically that story got out to the news in Australia and even in the United States of America. That actually rolled over into the community because we'd be having a cup of tea over those couple of weeks, and a lot of those people came up and said, well, I was afraid to come to a marae situation because I didn't understand it. And but being in that house gives me a sense of calmness.
To be honest with you, one of the things I had to do for myself was to turn off my mother brain and turn on my Meryl brain and go, I'm here to help. I'm not here to get too emotionally caught up in the moment, because I think there's jobs that we need to do, and we need to be able to speak to the public, and we need to be able to do media interviews, and we need to be able to give out information as it comes to light so that people are fully aware of what's gone down. It was a significant event in terms of world news as well. And in the middle of that, it was also dealing with things like we had local families who had been impacted, and making sure that we made contact with them to support them through that difficult time. Hayden Inman would be a classic example of a young man who worked for White Island Tours, had a passion for his job, and I, to this day, believe he heroically laid his life down for others. The stories that I've heard and just what I know and have learnt about Hayden would lead me to believe that he would have put others before his own life, and I believe he did that.
From the 60 lives Hayden once saved from a burning boat to his weekly donation at the local supermarket.
He would always leave a $5 note behind, but he wouldn't tell anyone. No one knew he did it because he did it out of the kindness of his heart.
Kia kaha, you've done New Zealand proud.
Whakatane's hero until the end.
The whole town, really, the whole of Whakatane and the surrounding area was sort of caught up in this, wasn't it? I mean, the hospital, the workers at the hospital.
And they said they were treating people who were injured, not only injured that they knew, but also passed away in the eruption. And the anaesthetist who was speaking in that story, she said, in amongst the chaos, she was stopping to talk to those injured, both the ones she knew as well as the strangers.
Business people. It's a small community, so everybody knew somebody who was very closely involved.
Yes, I knew Hayden. My company, when we were teaching people to dive, taught him to dive. He was full of life, loved fishing, loved diving, and was a very experienced guide with White Island Tours.
Are you still in touch with the local families of the victims?
Yes, I am. So Hayden Inman, I mentioned him, his mum and I became friends through this basically, and have maintained good contact with each other. Some of them have looked to maintaining some privacy, and I think that was one of the things we felt really strongly about, was particularly for those people where there'd been changes to their appearance and things like that, and there was a season where they were having multiple surgeries and all this kind of thing. And so I think we felt very defensive of their privacy, and that included ourselves. Like, if they don't want to contact them, we just give them the space they need.
The other sensitivity is, I guess, the role of Ngāti Awa as the main local iwi. I mean, there's a couple of things going on there. It's the owner of White Island Tours.
Yes. And they were the very recent owners too. I mean, that's the interesting thing. They had not long purchased that business and had taken it over, and were doing a very good job, I might add, and were, they were looking to develop it future further.
At the time of the eruption, or very shortly after, you said that tourist trips to Whakaari should continue. They haven't so far, but do you still believe that?
Well, here's I guess at the time I was, when I was asked the question, I said, because it was sort of asked in a way, do you trust the providers? And I absolutely did. I think here's what's going to be interesting is, if, for instance, the health and safety regulations put in place for Whakaari if it's to be ever visited again, if they are strict to the point that in the past, I think we visited it when it was seismically monitored 24/7. So when it was level 1 and some level 2, we could usually go out quite safely. If they drop that down to level 1 and say, well, you can only go out there and land on the island and visit it that way, if it's at level 1, I suspect, and I may be wrong, but I suspect it may not be level 1 often enough to be viable from a financial point of view to equip and go.
I'm just wondering what other lasting effects do you feel in the community of the Whakaari eruption? I
think it's now a wedded part of our history, and the White Island, I think, still is even if people got in a boat and floated around and had a look from the island, it's a fascinating environment, absolutely fascinating.
The trial, that's a key point also in this whole process.
Something that's not as well understood is that the people on trial are not so much related to what happened on the day. It is more to do with complying or not complying with the adventure tourism safety requirements, which were the standards good enough, and had everybody met the ones that were in place? And that was more the concern, rather than actually how people behaved on the day. But it's many of the people who were held to account were people who, in that moment, were absolutely heroic. There's no other way to describe it. It's remembering what happened, those we lost, those whose lives have been impaired, and then those who responded with huge courage and fortitude in what was a terrifying situation, absolutely terrifying.
Whakaari's Whakaari, and we still love her, and she's still a beautiful island that we go and visit and spend time out there with.
Do you think, Joe, that it has changed the culture of the town at all, or changed the relationships in the town, changed the community, I suppose?
I think that it has. The involvement of the iwi now at the decision-making table, at the council, and on a lot of levels, we find ourselves now sitting at the table to support and to help in making decisions about our community. And I think that was the bringing together of our people at that particular time, in a time of tragedy, just opened the doors to being able to work as one, I suppose, work together, which we did through that whole tragedy. Quite often you'll get National Emergency Service and all of the services, they work apart from the people at place. The iwi at place played a big role in the beginning of every day with Karakia offering the whare nui as a place to meet, to catch up with what was happening over those couple of weeks. We had our people at the airport receiving the bodies off the island the day they brought them off the island, and they allowed us to carry out our protocols to bring them to that place where all of the families could come and grieve at the airport. And it's probably the first time that we have felt that we have been a part of a whole process as the iwi. Change is slow, but I see the coming together of a community, and that tragedy brought us together, I think.
And the trial's expected to take 16 weeks. That's it for today. The Detail is supported by the Public Interest Journalism Fund. Today's episode was engineered by William Saunders. Our producers are Alexia Russell, Sarah Robson and Bonnie Harrison. And thanks to Joe Harawira, Amy Williams and Judy Turner. Ka kite anō.